And here we are. But who cares about next week, guys? We're here tonight to talk about querying agents. So I've thrown your bio up here, Sharon. But I wanted to welcome you, first of all, Sharon Pelletier, right? Am I Pelletier? And just ask you before we jump in, if you wouldn't mind, everyone, of course, can access your bio on the Dystel, Goderich, and Bourret website. But I'd love to hear just a little bit more about how you came to agenting and how you discovered that it was the fit for you, that it was a role that you wanted to take on in the publishing industry. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I've been at the agency for about coming up on 8 years now. Prior to this, I worked at Barnes & Noble for several years, and then I worked at a couple of small publishers in editorial. And I was always told by, mentors and smart industry people that I was talking to as I was, planning next steps and trying to learn as much as I could, that agenting would be a really good fit for me, a really good fit for the way I like to work with authors. The thing I was really motivated to get into publishing for was to work with authors over the course of their career, help grow them, grow with them. And so these smart people were telling me, agents are the ones now, the way the publishing industry works now, agents are the ones that can stay with a client their whole career. Editors move around from house to house, they go freelance, they become agents themselves. But your agent can stick with you, whatever's happening with your books and whoever your publisher and editor are. And I always just sort of nodded politely and smiled and thought to myself, I can absolutely never be an agent. I can't argue about money. I can't look at contracts. I was picturing sort of like a Jerry Maguire meets the Pelican Brief type situation, I think, where I was just constantly going to be like doing important papers and yelling at people on the phone about money. But publishing industry being what it is, I did spend a little bit of time unemployed and freelancing, and then ended up with an interview at Dystel, Goderich, and Bourret when I was really just done with the freelance hustle. It's great for many people. It is not for me. And ready, I think, to have a little bit more of an open mind. And the more I heard about the agency, how it works, what my role would be, what my role could grow into, the more I liked it. And then as soon as I started and signed my first client and started, working on their manuscript, connecting with editors, all that good stuff, I realized that everyone who was telling me that I would be a good agent was correct. I could have listened to them a long time ago and saved myself some trouble. I like that it is a good fit for my interest in editorial work. I find that very creatively satisfying, but also I get to have kind of a bird's eye view of the whole, how is the marketing working? What advantages does this author have that maybe the publisher isn't thinking about using? What problem have they hit in their career, and how can we creatively find a solution to get them to the next step? All of that has drawn on all the jobs I've had throughout my life, kind of getting to where I am now. It's never boring. And I think that's what kind of makes me happy to be following authors of their career for the long haul, beyond my glorious, early naive views of how amazing the editorial relationship can be.
Yeah.
Which it is, but being an agent is also great in so many more ways that I wouldn't have realized before I threw myself into it.
I love that realization you had about sort of what you were assuming agenting would be like, and then assuming that your personality or just what you enjoy doing wouldn't be a good fit. And I'll just say part of the reason why I do this Ask Us Anything is because I was an agent at one time for a good number of years before I left New York. And before that, I worked inside publishing houses. But I remember thinking initially, like, that's not for me. Agenting is sales, and I don't want to sell things. I don't want to be someone who sells, widgets or what have you. And I think the thing that I realized was these are books, and these are ideas, and these are creative people, and these are writers that I love. And it also just feels, even when you're pushing for that extra amount of money, or you're pushing back on marketing or anything else, it feels less like the salesy kind of part of the job, and more like just a passion and something that you believe strongly in and feel good about fighting for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more like when I would sell a book in the bookstore, when I worked in the bookstore, it was a lot more like recommending the perfect book to a customer that I saw every month. Selling a book to an editor is a lot more like that than, you know, a car salesman or a real estate agent might be. And then also when you are arguing about money or fighting about territories or some of the more, you know, nitty gritty business stuff, it still doesn't feel like, you know, a hustle, because you believe so much in the author and in their work, and you're invested in protecting their interests and getting them the best compensation for their creative, you know, material than you would be if you were selling cars or pharmaceuticals or what have you. You know, it's not just a product, it's someone's creative heart that you're selling. So even though there are business decisions that are made, it doesn't feel the way, at least for me on the inside, that I thought it would from the outside looking in.
Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I also want, before we move into the questions, I don't want to miss having the opportunity to mention that you are one of our favorite Austin-based authors, agents, and that's Amy Gentry, whose book Bad Habits just published this week, her third novel. And if I understand if I understand the story correctly, Amy and you connected through a Twitter competition. Would that be correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
How does
Yeah, I
that
think it was
work?
yeah, this was several years ago, because her book that came out this week is her third book. So this is probably 6 or 7 years ago. Still sort of in the early days of Twitter pitch events. She tweeted about her book, you know, a really good kind of summary of the stakes and characters in her first book, Good Is Gone. It caught my eye, and the way it works is you favorite the tweet, and then the writers send to the agents who have favorited their tweets. And so that was how we initially connected. She then sent me, you know, a regular query and her pages and all that. And from there, the process went the way it does ordinarily. But at least at that point, the Twitter contests were a really great way to cut through kind of some of the chaos and noise that can surround querying, because you can go out and look for stuff that's exactly what you want to read right now, as opposed to just waiting to see what finds you. You can kind of go out and find it in a really efficient way. And then also, I've always found that a really good, interesting Twitter pitch is the sign of someone that has a book with really strong stakes and well-developed characters. If that's coming across in a way that the, you know, 2 sentences in your tweet sound gripping and, oh, I want to read that, you've probably done a good job with the book that lies behind it. It's hard to write a strong, grabby hook for a book that you yourself haven't quite really figured out what's motivating the main character, or why the final dilemma is so important, or what have you. So, you know, I don't do as many Twitter pitch contests now as I would like to, because I'm a little busy, but I do still like popping in when I can, and looking for that, you know, 2 sentences that sound like something I can't wait to read, and seeing who's the person and what's the book behind that tweet.
I love it. All right, as we keep going, we are going to get into query letters, and I think that's going to be a part of the conversation, what you just said, that idea of being able to talk about your book in a way that's compelling in a very short amount of space. So I know folks are going to be interested to hear some of your tips for that. So we're going to jump in. We asked folks to send questions in, and you did. So I do want to just remind you that if you are sending stuff in the chat box, if you only send it to all panelists, then only Sharon and I are going to see it. If you want to send it to everybody, or make sure that everyone sees it, then you're going to send to all panelists and attendees. So just look at that little blue bar and click the arrow. Consider holding your questions until the end, because we are going to get to a lot of questions and hit on a lot of different topics. So just wait and see if we actually touch on what you were going to ask. And if we don't, for sure, we'll give you some time to follow up with some questions if we have the time at the end. But we're going to get started by asking, where do you start? So I've grouped the questions into different sort of subcategories so that we can make some sense out of all of the stuff that folks are interested in learning. And we're starting with, where do you start? And these questions were all sort of in the same area. How do you find the area that an agent specializes in? How do you find a good agent for your first book? What are the best resources for finding and researching agents? So I wonder, Sharon, what tips you have for folks who are looking, just starting from scratch, in terms of starting to identify who might be a good fit for them.
Yeah, a really great first place to start is with the books you love to read, that are like the kind of storytelling that you are doing. Make sure you read the acknowledgement section, and usually writers will thank their agents there. And so then you can kind of make note, okay, I loved this book. This feels like the way I want to tell a story. This feels like the way I want to explore this issue. Make a note of who that author's agent is, and then when you go to the next step of your research, you can find out, where does that agent work? Are they still open to clients right now, or is this an older book and maybe they're not working anymore? That's a really good way to connect with agents who love the kind of work that you are trying to do. Another good way to find agents is with Publishers Marketplace, which is a paid database, but you can, advice I often hear authors giving is pay for a month. I think it's like $25 for a month.
Yeah.
Towards maybe the middle or end when you have your initial list of names that you've gleaned, and then you can do some deep dives into, okay, here are the names I have. What are they selling right now? It's not completely comprehensive because it's only what's announced, and there are a lot of things that affect when and why something is announced, but it'll give you a good sense of who the agents you're interested in are selling to the most often, how often they're selling. Do they seem like they know what they're doing, or they seem like they're just selling to a bunch of little presses that you've never heard of any of their books? And then I think the other tool that can be really helpful is it's a website called Manuscript Wishlist, and agents and editors put profiles up on there describing their interests. What books do they wish they had worked on? What's a really specific thing that they would love to find a thriller or a romance that features? That's also a really good place to look, because it tends to be younger and mid-career agents who are still eagerly signing up clients, who are putting the time into maintaining their profiles there and giving lots of details to try to make sure that projects they'll be most excited about find them, as opposed to agents who might be later in their career signing up fewer new clients because their list is pretty full with successful writers who need a lot of their time.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the three main ways to find names. And then when you have a name you're interested in, you can cross-reference against the other places. What are their books? What do they say on Manuscript Wishlist? And it can also be helpful if you have an agent that seems like is a really good fit for you. Check out their social media. See, often agents are tweeting or even posting on Instagram about what books they're loving, what they're hoping to find, things that they really loved in a query or find really annoying. Once you kind of have your list of dream agents, that's a great way to really figure out the right way to catch their attention.
And would you say for folks who want to find out what you represent or what most agents represent, is it as simple as once you've identified the agent, you're going to go to their website and see what their bio says?
Yeah, their website, our website, for example, lists all our clients by category. It doesn't break them out by agent. But then if you look at each agent's social media, we're posting about our clients' books. So you can get a sense for, the books I have coming out in the next 3 months. You're going to see a lot about them if you look at my Twitter every day for 2 weeks. Yeah. Social media maybe is not a great way to build your initial list, and for your initial names, you probably need to do something more like Publishers Marketplace or Manuscript Wishlist. But once you kind of have some names that you can tell, okay, this person is working in my category, wants to find books like mine, the website and their social media is a great way to find out more about the right way to get their attention.
Perfect. And it looks like people are answering. Marmy asked the question what the name of the website was that folks spend. I believe it is still $25 a month, but that's Publishers Marketplace. So, great tips.
Oh, and the other one I should mention is Query Tracker.
Yes.
Which is where writers will post little comments. I queried this agent and 3 months later, here's what she said, or I queried this person and I signed with them. They do interviews with people who have signed with agents. It's also a great way to find out what to expect when you do know which agents you want to query.
Do you pay attention to your pages or what folks are saying on querytracker.net about you?
Officially, no, because that's probably crazy, but unofficially, yes, I do. I look at it every once in a while, in part because I would want to know if someone was really upset about something that had happened with their query. But also just because I'm nosy and like to see what's being said about me.
There's another website, and I hesitate to even say this name, and I'm not sure how active it is, but it's called Absolute Right. Do you know Absolute Right?
I've
And
heard of it, yeah.
that is like a rabbit hole, because that is
Mhm.
where people are literally like, I just queried Becca Oliver yesterday and she got back to me in 27 minutes. And it's like very specific feedback on agents. And as an agent, it's awful to look at.
Is that the one that has a bulletin board section for kind of like shady or bad news agencies and publishers? Okay.
Yeah, that is a great resource for that, for sure.
Yeah, especially if you are participating in something like a Twitter contest, or if you hear about an agent, but they don't really seem to have very many deals announced, or everyone they work with aren't publishers you've heard of. Looking at something like that is a good way to see, is this person legit and just new and getting started, or is it someone that might not know what they're doing?
Yeah, I'll put the name.
Just to kind of double check.
It's called Absolute Right, and it's all message boards, I believe, and they're all like categorized by agency and then other places. Yes, we are recording for Andrew, but you can find what we were just talking about on Absolute Right, and we'll make sure that after this, you know what, we'll go ahead and send an email to everyone who registered with a lot of these links that we're mentioning, just to make it easier for you. So let's talk a little bit about submission guidelines, because once you make that list, that's sort of, now you have to make sure that you're following the sort of protocols that an agent has in place. So I love this question because I get it a lot, and I would love to hear what you say. So if an agent asks for a specific number of pages, I want 10 pages, is it acceptable to send them 1 or 2 more pages to finish out the chapter? Are you supposed to be to the letter of what they're asking for, or can you be a little, can you work around that?
Sure, yeah, it's totally fine to get to a chapter break or section break close to whatever the cutoff they asked for is. The thing you don't want to do that I do see a lot is so our agency asked for 25 pages and someone will write in and say, here's my query. I know you wanted 25 pages, but I've sent 50 because my book starts getting really interesting in chapter 3. So I wanted to make sure you got that. Completely understand where you're coming from, but you have a bigger problem than the number of pages in our guidelines. Your book needs to be interesting from page 1. If I'm not going to wait 50 pages for it to be interesting, the editor is not, the bookseller is not, the person browsing in the store on Amazon is not. So if you find yourself worrying that an agency's guidelines are too short to get to where your book is interesting, that's a good point to maybe pause in your query process and figure out, well, why do I think my book is not interesting until this point? Maybe that's where your book needs to start. Maybe you need to rework your opening pages before that a little bit. But if you're wondering about the pages number being a problem, think about why it's a problem and where the problem actually is. But to answer this question, yes, it's definitely fine to go a little short or a little bit long to get to a reasonable, natural break in your material.
I'm so glad you brought that up about 25 versus 50, because my story really starts to take off at 29 or 30, because also I'll hear, okay, but I have a prologue and the prologue isn't really that interesting, so can I just start at page 1 of the first chapter? And I think it's the same thing. If you have a prologue and your prologue feels like it's bogging down just getting the story started, then maybe you don't need a prologue.
I'm notorious for murdering prologues. So many times say, I love this book, but you have to cut the prologue. Especially in suspense categories, people use it to try to, snapshot a really exciting moment. But the thing that makes you care about a book is, first off, the characters, not someone stabbing someone or a really steamy kiss or what have you. So think about how you can make the characters seem interesting, whether it's lovable interesting or hateable interesting, by the end of your first page, not what's the most exciting scene that I can slap at the front of my book to try to hook the person fast.
I love it. Great. Okay, moving on. When do you query? Oh boy, so I put these two together because I felt like they were pretty hand in hand. You always hear that your novel needs to be polished before querying, which I understand. However, that definition is subjective. So the idea of how many times you're supposed to revise, especially if you know that your agent, we hear agents are going to do some editing, the editor's going to do some editing, how polished is polished? And then the other question was, with the number of big publishers continuing to shrink, how polished percentage-wise must submitted manuscripts be for someone to take them on? So what do you say about this question of how polished it needs to be before they query you with it?
Yeah. So what you want is your manuscript, when you query, to be as good as you can possibly make it with the resources available to you. You've revised it, you've taken a break, you've read it again, you've revised it more, you've swapped with a critique partner or a writer's group. You've done everything you can do to take it as far as you can. It is as polished as you can possibly make it, both in terms of the actual polish, which is, you know, every word is right, the commas are in the right spot, and then bigger picture stuff like your characters, your pacing, your story development. You don't want to be thinking, okay, well, this is good enough because my agent is going to copy edit it for me, or well, the publisher will have a proofreader so they can like check this stuff with the timeline. That's true, all that will happen. I will flag things if I see a problem with the timeline or I don't understand what this character is doing that, but you want it to be as good as you can make it by yourself. So then when you start working with me, it's new information, it's new tools, it's new perspectives to get it to a higher level than you get it by yourself. And then again, the editor gets it to the higher level after that. That's definitely true, as there are fewer places to sell books and more competition for, you know, each check that an editor writes. I think the question of, I'm not exactly looking at, is this polished enough for me or not? It's more, is there something I love about this enough that I can see exactly how to sell it? And I don't want someone else to be the one who gets to sell it. I want it to be me. I want to be the one that gets my hands in this book and gets to work with this writer again. But also it's, do I have a vision for how to take this to the next level? I read manuscripts all the time that it's not like, well, this is bad, it's not good enough for me. It's fine. I'm not excited about it for whatever reason. You know, the infamous did not connect that people hate hearing. It's not something that I want to get my hands on with the writer in their next book and their next book. So it's not that I'm looking at, okay, well, this is 70% there. If it was at 75, I take it on. It's more, do I love this as it is? And do I see that what it needs is something that I would be good at helping with?
Where do you come down on writers before they approach you, or even after they approach you and before you go to a publisher, having the independent or freelance editor hired to work on it? Do you have recommendations either way?
It's definitely not necessary. It's definitely not necessary at the beginning of your query process. Especially because now with the internet, it is pretty accessible to find a writer you can swap with for free without having to spend money on an editor to read your book and give you a neutral, somewhat informed perspective on, are they interested? Does it make sense? Do they buy the twist? Or did they want the couple to get together? What have you? If you have been querying for a while, are getting lots of requests and then passes, that might be a sign then that there's something bigger in your manuscript that you might want professional help to address. But I don't think it's necessary to spend money on that at the outset. And the other thing that when someone queries and they're like, okay, here's my book and I've hired this editor to work on it with me, it makes me wonder a little bit, well, what is the writer I'm actually getting? Because I don't know who this editor is that you worked with. I don't know how much rewriting they did versus just pointing out stuff to you. Revision is an important skill for a writer. And I need to have a sense that you can do that on your own in addition to working with someone. And if I don't know anything about the editor you hired or what that process looked like, I don't have as much confidence necessarily that you can revise your next book with me, or you can revise this book with your editor. So I think if you're thinking about hiring an editor, you need to have a clear goal in mind, what you want that to accomplish. Do you need to figure out why your foals aren't getting offers, or are you just nervous that your book is not going to be good enough when you go to agents? If it's the latter, that's not something you necessarily want to spend money on as much as just connecting with a critique partner or writers group to beta read it for you. If that makes sense.
That's great advice. Thank you. All right. How many queries should you limit yourself to having out at the same time? And how many agents do you tell people to query before considering other options? So what are your thoughts on this in terms of, obviously you're coming at it from the point of view of the person who's getting all the queries, but do you have an idea of, or do you have any feelings about how authors might or writers might approach this process?
Yeah. As for how many you should have out at the same time, I think it's as many as you can keep organized and comfortably manage, because ideally one of those agents is going to read your book and say, this is amazing, I want to represent it. And then you need to go to all the other agents that have your material, and probably all the ones that have your query, but definitely all the ones who have requested your material, and say, I have an offer. I would like to hear from you if you're interested in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever you decide. So for some people, that might mean they need to query 5 agents at a time to feel that they have a handle on that. Some people might be doing 10 or 15. But you need to be able to keep it somewhat organized, so you know who you sit what to when and who you heard back from. And also you need to be researching each of them and making sure this is someone who's a good fit for you, someone who's open to queries, you're following their guidelines. If you're trying to send out to 30 people, that's a lot of information and spreadsheet tabs to keep a hold of. In terms of how many, if the second question is about before you, I'm not exactly sure what the other options would be, if that's like the next book or.
Well, I guess it could mean, I take it to mean considering other options for getting that work published without an agent might be to interpret that. And then, yeah, sure. It could be also before you move on to the next project and start focusing on that.
Yeah.
Fun, huh? Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'll answer that. I haven't gotten that question before. But I have had, when I'm offering representation to an author, they do often ask how many publishers will we go to before we stop. And my answer is always as many as are a good fit for the book and can publish it well. So it will depend on the book. For some books that might be 20, for some books that might be 40. And I think the same would apply to agents. You would go to as many agents as you feel with your research are a good fit for your book, are selling in the territory that you want to be published in. But also, I think before you give up, you want to look at what sorts, are you not getting any requests, which means maybe your query needs work? Are you getting lots of requests, but then passes, which means maybe your manuscript needs work? I think before you give up or move on, you also need to take a clear look at what are my no's, and have I solved the problems that those no's might be coming from? And I think it also helps to have a clear view of what your book is and how much it fits with the market right now. If you're writing about, space monkeys, you might run out of agents a lot more quickly than, women's fiction about mothers and daughters, or something that has a much broader, readership and group of professionals working in it. I hope that kind of covers what this person is asking.
Brittany, if you want to add any more into the chat box about that might clarify further, but we're going to keep going. And then if we didn't answer it, we'll circle back to you for sure. So we're going to talk about the query letter, because of course it's a big part of this. So some of these are very, straightforward in terms of sort of the template of a query letter and other things. And then some are a little bit bigger, but when submitting, how much do you pay attention to the actual sort of business formal of the query letter or not? Like the aesthetics, I guess, of the query letter.
Yeah, you don't need to set it up like a letter on letterhead as if you were sending it through the mail. And in fact, I would suggest that you don't, because we're so often reading queries in little snatches of time on our phones or tablets. So then we're just like scrolling through more stuff to get to who you actually are and what your book is. The important thing is at the end to include, your name your website or your social media, maybe where you live, like that little bit about you at the end. But I know where I work. I know, the date is coded into the email. You don't have to set it up the way a print letter would be.
Thank you for freeing us of that anxiety. What's the best way to query for a fiction series? Do agents accept series? I think this is a great question because folks wrestle with this all the time. The idea is to focus your query letter on one project, right? And sometimes what I have found is that it can be a turnoff if someone's already talking about the next book, the next book, the next book. But in some genres, it's expected that there's potentially going to be a series. So what's your advice for folks who are expecting to write a series, but they're querying for the first book?
Sure. Well, it's good to have a clear view of how series fit in the category you're writing in. So if you're writing cozies, if you're writing a procedural detective, if you're writing certain kinds of sci-fi or fantasy, series are very standard, even desirable. So that's great. If you're writing, domestic suspense or upmarket women's fiction, series are a lot less common. So if you're writing one, or if you would like to write one, you should be aware of that. And in that case, you would want to make sure you lean on, or you make clear in the query that your book can stand alone. It doesn't need the second book or the third book to finish the story. A sentence that I think is very helpful, whichever side of that divide you fall on, is, a standalone with series potential. Because then that means if this does well, if readers like it, if it's an editor who has a vision for a series, you know where the story is going to go. But it also shows that you understand how to write a satisfying book that's contained within itself, and it doesn't have to be a trilogy for the reader to feel that they had a good reading experience. I think the other thing, it's not necessarily a turnoff if someone says, this is the first book of my series, the second one I'm revising, the third one is going to be about this. But my concern is always how you're shepherding your writing time. If you've already written the second book, if the first one doesn't sell, we can't sell the second one. So I'm more interested in hearing you have ideas for other standalone books, or if you didn't sign an agent for your first book, don't query the second one in the series, query something new. As far as the best way to query, if you want it to be a series, I think you would want to focus on agents who have successfully sold series, or the agents who represent the series that you love, that you see doing well, because then that's something they're really interested in, and understand how to connect it with the editors who are interested in that.
Perfect. All right. This one's not hard at all. What is your best query tip, especially something that's less well known?
Oh man.
And I want to reserve the right for you to keep this in your head, and as we keep going, circle back to it if something pops into your head. But if you have something right now, go for it.
Yeah, the less well-known part might take me a minute. Well, okay, I will say this. And query tips tend to be a little bit negative just because we do see so much that can be an obstacle. But I'm going to mention this because it's happened a lot this week to me and to coworkers. Do not comment on the agent's appearance, even if you are trying to be complimentary. Do not say, "You have such a nice smile," or "You look like my main character," or anything like that. Because it's just, I know our pictures are out there, but you should be querying an agent because of their professional bio and credentials, not because of how they look. And it's just a little unsettling and weird.
Yeah, keep it professional, right?
Yeah, keep it professional. Yeah. Which is not to say you can't say something personal like, I too love Diet Cokes when it's too late at night for them, or something like that. But just think about, is this something that they've shared in a professional setting, or am I being slightly creepy and weird? I had a query once that said something like, it opened with something like, "I know where you live and I've been across the street." And the person was trying to be chatty about being from my neighborhood, but it just came across as scary. So when you're trying to do that, personal opening, just think about, is this still professional, or is this maybe a little bit creepy or strange? even though I don't mean it to be. So I guess maybe that's the less well-known part of that question. But beyond that, my best tip is always just do your research and follow guidelines.
Maybe what we say about dialogue is the same thing for a query letter. Read it aloud and see how it sounds. And if it sounds like you wouldn't want someone to say that to someone in your own life, then don't say it.
Yeah. If someone I didn't know sent this to me, how would I feel? Yeah.
So how should an unagented author who's previously been published with indie presses position herself with a potential agent? So I think a great question, that idea of you have some track record, but maybe it's not, a huge track record or platform, but you have been published previously. How do you talk about that sort of thing in a query letter?
Yeah. I think you talk about it very matter-of-factly. If you just have moderate sales and so platform like this is describing, I think you want to start with your book first. My such and such word count, this category, this title novel is for fans of X and Y. Go into your story pitch just as you would for any other query. And then in your bio, you say, I have published 3 titles with XYZ Press to, strong critical response. I don't think you have to say much because the agent still wants to love your book, love your writing, love your story. You want to be prepared with your sales figures. You want to be prepared to have a conversation with the agent about why you're now choosing to work with an agent. What is the situation with your press? Do they have, any sort of option claim on the new book? But you don't have to put all that in the query. With the query, you want it just to be very simple, acknowledging I have published with this place and whatever is sort of impressive or appealing about what your experience was. If you have, a USA Today bestseller or something that's really splashy and amazing, you can maybe start with that before you go into your book. But if it's just sort of the way this is described, kind of room for improvement, some things to be excited about, just incorporate it in your bio very matter-of-factly and have more detail available for an interested agent to discuss with you.
And how do you feel about not including that in your bio and bringing it up when you have a phone call? So meaning allowing it not, sometimes when I talk to folks about query letters, I say, I prefer to leave out distractions. I prefer to leave out things where I might go down a rabbit hole and start looking at sales numbers for that book or doing other things, but not in the intention of hiding it, but more things that are going to be relevant at some point, but aren't necessarily relevant to just getting this person to start reading, I think are okay to save for that conversation if they're interested. But how do you feel about that?
I disagree a little bit. I agree completely with the advice. Don't include things that aren't relevant. I don't need to know how many dogs you have if your book is not about dogs. I don't need to know that you love knitting if your book is not about knitting. If I love your story, read your pages, like your voice, I'm going to request more. I'm going to Google you anyway. And then I'm going to find, oh, she already has 3 books out with XYZ Press. And then I'm going to feel not thrilled that that wasn't in the query. And definitely if I'm going to call and offer to represent you, I'm going to already have done a lot of research on whatever Google has to offer about you. I shouldn't say a lot, but an initial spurt of Googling. And I prepare for a call, so my questions are going to be different if I know that you had a small press experience versus if I think that you're a brand new debut, staggering out on fawn legs into the forest of publishing. So I would at least mention the fact that you have been published before. You don't have to get into all the details, but I like to see it mentioned if you have either self-published or worked with a small press. Because I'm going to find it out pretty quickly if there is something I really like. And if that's never a reason why I don't read the pages or won't get pulled into the story. So my advice is to mention it.
I love it. Okay. We're going to keep going. What does it take to get an agent interested in a self-published book?
Yeah. At this point in the evolution of self-publishing, hybrid publishing, and traditional publishing, what it takes is a really good unpublished book not in that series. It's very, very, very rare these days that a publisher picks up a self-published book and republishes it. It happens. You hear a lot about it because those are the outliers, and those are the ones that sold, 90 bajillion copies. So the short answer that I think this question is getting at is probably going to be, well, there's a genre I like this story idea, I like this voice, and your self-publishing track record is impressive. Which is not to say that if you sold 20 copies and I love everything else about it, I won't take you on. But for that quick flare of like, oh, wow, it's going to be the number of sales you had with your self-published book. But again, it needs to be, the thing you're sending me needs to be unpublished and new. And you have something impressive with the books you self-published. And usually it needs to be a standalone, not the third book when you self-publish the first two, because again, usually publishers don't want to come in midstream unless you are huge with the ones that you did self-publish.
Great advice.
And there's still a lot of advice out there that says it's a great, self-publish, it's a great way to establish yourself. Look at all the authors that this worked for. If you're reading a post that has that advice, look at the date and make sure it is recent, because that was, 2011, 2012, 2013 that self-published authors were selling like crazy. And it's not working the same way today.
All right, thank you. What are the worst or funniest mistakes? I think we might have covered this. I think we might have covered with the talking about how you look in your query letter, but are there any other funny mistakes you care to mention? I'm trying to think about it.
Yeah, I've definitely seen funny ones.
I've seen, I mentioned in my, in the class that I sometimes teach, that I used to see emails that would be to me and 15 other agents. So they would not be BCC, they would actually be flat out like on the email. So that's always, it's always a surprise, but, but I think injecting too much personality into a query letter can feel like the right thing to do because it distinguishes you, but at the same time, it can just come off not in the way that you're expecting it to, just because it's a written document and you're introducing yourself for the first time to someone.
Yeah. I think the things that are funniest, that there are things that are funny mistakes that we're sort of laughing with the writer. Like you can see that they misspelled a word and it turned out funny, or their word count came out at 300,000 instead of 30,000 or whatever. Well, not 30,000, but the things that we laugh at that you would want to avoid would be people can come across sometimes as, it's good to be confident about your work, but you don't want to be braggadocious or negative about either the agent or other books that are successful. And then the other thing that's really funny is sometimes people include their headshots or glamour shots they've had taken to send out. And sometimes those can be unintentionally hilarious when you open the email and you see like, a Tom Selleck in the 70s-esque headshot that someone's tried to send with their book. So those are funny in a way that it's a mistake in the sense that it's definitely not helping you, but it gives us a laugh.
All right, we'll keep going. What's the biggest, well, I think we're kind of covering that as well, like biggest query faux pas. So I'm going to keep going because we have so many questions. Do agents prefer comparisons to other novels in a query letter? And how important is it in query letters to have comps? How many comps should you list? And how recent should those comps have been published? Where do you come down on comparisons?
Yeah, I love seeing comps when they're good. Good is the last 3 to 4 years, and books that are successful but not runaway game-changing hits, because the books that are huge have that X factor that doesn't really give us much information about how we'll replicate that success for your book. So you would want to use, Amy Gentry instead of good as, Gone Girl, or, I'm trying to even think of another example. But the rule of thumb is you want it to be recent, specific, and successful, but not just gangbuster successful. 2 to 3 is great. The other thing that comps can do really well is show me that you know your category and that you understand how your book is going to fit in the market. Even if it's not the same comps I end up using when I pitch to editors, if they're good comps, on the one hand, I say, oh yeah, I would love to read, Beach Read meets The Goldfinch or whatever. But then also that shows me, oh, this person really understands what people loved about Beach Read, and they really understand what people, that's actually a terrible comparison because those books would have no overlap. That's just the first 2 books I saw over here. But it shows me that it's someone who, the writer is thinking thoughtfully about their work from a business perspective, not just, I love my book, I think it's amazing, it's going to sell as many copies as Harry Potter did, or as many copies as Gone Girl did. And that's the same reason we talk about follow guidelines, all the other rules we say to follow. It's not just to jump through hoops. It's also because it shows that you are putting time and research into the business side, which is, we're partnering with you because we love your work and are creatively excited about it, but also it's still someone we're going to have to work with from a business perspective, which can be more or less of a nightmare based on how ready you are to take that part of it as seriously as you take the art part of it.
What would you recommend for, and someone asked me this the other day, and I was sort of trying to come up with a great way to answer it. When you say, successful in terms of sales, at least for someone who doesn't have access to BookScan and doesn't, how do you judge whether something is successful?
Sure. I think the quickest, or I shouldn't say quickest, but the most accessible ways to judge are look at the number of reviews on Amazon. If something has 10 reviews, it's a lot less likely to have sold a ton of copies than if it has 100 than if it has 1,000. If it's fairly recent, you can look at Amazon ranking. That's not always helpful if the book is maybe 2 or 3 years old, but if it's 3 months old, the ranking can still be pretty active and give you a good, if it's in the top 1,000, then it's probably selling pretty well right now. And then the other thing that's helpful to look at is Google the title with reviews and see what kinds of places are reviewing it. Did it get a Starred Publishers Weekly review? Did it get 6 of the major trade reviews? That also shows that it's going to be on a lot of agent and editors' radars. Even if the sales are disappointing, we still will have a sense of books that everyone was excited about or books that felt important. And especially when you're querying agents, if it has a lot of reviews, that's a book that we're at least going to know about that helps us from the perspective of, okay, I understand this story, I understand the tone, I understand how funny or scary it is. And then I often will update the comps to be like, well, that is a great comp, but people don't realize that even though it was buzzy everywhere, it didn't sell any copies. So then I'll change it to something that sold a little better. But I think those are kind of the 2. Look at reviews that come up with a quick Google, and look at reader review numbers on Amazon or Goodreads for kind of a guess at how many people know about this and how many people are buying it.
That's great. Thank you. What do you look at first? Do you look at the query letter first? Do you look at the pages first? Do you go to the author bio? Tell us what you do when you're first sort of approaching that submission packet of information.
Yeah, so I look at the query first, for sure. And I just kind of go in order. So the first sentence, is this word count on target or is it insane? Are there comps that seem appealing? All are those things, those are all things that will start to get me excited. Then I look at the story. Do I understand what the story is? Does it seem like a fresh premise? Does it seem like stakes are there? Is there a character that I'm already intrigued by? Quick peek at the bio, more to kind of see, does this person already have publication credits, or is there something they can mention that shows that they're serious about their work? So like they attend Writers League of Texas every year, they're a member of a local writing group, or maybe the premise was about a veterinarian. They mentioned they worked in a veterinarian's office for 10 years. But But all of that for me, at least, is kind of a skim to get a sense of what is this? How excited am I about it? Does it seem like it's even a fit for me or not? And then I go to the pages and start the first page and see how excited am I getting? How promising does this feel? Am I getting sucked in right away? Do I feel like this is a great story idea, but the author hasn't really found their voice yet? And then if I'm reading the pages and liking the voice, then I'll go back and read the query a little more carefully and kind of see, okay, so where is this going to go? What is this going to be? But it's always query first for me. And I think for most agents, because you want to know what you're reading before you start reading it.
What about word count? What would you say would be your expectations for the sorts of categories that you cover in terms of what word count you would expect to see, what word count would turn you off? I often tell folks that if the agent isn't asking for it in their submission guidelines, that not including word count is okay. But do you agree with that? Do you always want word count to be in the query letter?
I do. And that's good to know, because maybe we should put it in our submission guidelines. I don't actually know if it's in ours or not expressly to put that. I do really like to see it, just because it is such a quick peek at, is the book you've written remotely viable? If you have a great premise and I like your voice, I don't want to find out that your detective novel is 20,000 words or 200,000 words after I've already spent, 15 minutes reading it and starting to like it. As far as what's a good word count, so I represent adult upmarket fiction in a variety of genres. 70 to 90,000 words is going to be what you want to aim for. I've sold books that are 100. A couple times I've signed things that came over, but I made the author cut it way down. Fantasy, you can go into 110, 120. Middle grade is going to be in the 50s. Really, literary fiction can be 50 or 60,000. But generally, if you're writing rom-coms, women's fiction, suspense, crossover fantasy or sci-fi, you kind of want to try to be between 70 and 90.
All right. Thank you.
Which is not to say if you're at 92, I'm going to delete it unread. That's definitely fine. But I find that giving someone a very strict word count goal is a great way to make them cut things that strengthen the book, which is a whole nother craft topic that we won't get into. But there's a reason why word counts exist, and it's not arbitrary to just let people in or kick them out. It correlates to a book that is well paced and has nothing it doesn't need, and isn't missing anything it does need. And that's why we look at it and we say, 175,000 words, delete. It's not just because, well, you missed this checkbox, too bad for you. It's because we know it correlates to the readiness of the project and the writer.
Right. All right. Thank you. I'm going to start telling people to include word count. How does one get their foot in the door of an agency? I've had no luck getting responses from literary agents via email queries. And, I included this one in here. It's so tough to answer, right? I mean, so tough to answer because it's probably very specific to the project too. But do you have any sort of advice to someone who has just been querying and isn't having any luck?
Yeah. I think there's two things you want to look at. One is, are you querying the right agents? Have you done the research to make sure that the people that you're querying are currently looking for your category or genre, are currently open to queries? Is it mostly people who have been agents for 30 years and maybe are only signing up 1 or 2 clients a year? And then the other thing you want to look at is your query itself. If you're not getting responses, or if you're only getting quick form no's, do some Googling, look at websites like Query Shark, read a lot of query letters that are successful. Ask a writer friend to read your query and give feedback and tell you what they're interested in or not interested in. Find a conference that's accessible to you and take a class on queries, read blog posts about query tips, figure out what is maybe your query doing wrong. Maybe you need different comps. Maybe your query is way too long. Maybe your story pitch is all very general and doesn't give a sense of what the stakes really are in your story or why your main character is so interesting. I think one of those two things is probably fixing one of those two things or both is going to help you a lot. And that's also all that's in your control. You cannot control how excited the people you're sending to might be to have another query at just the moment yours comes in, or what they signed before you, or what they read right after you. But you can control improving your query with information that is readily available to you on the internet, and you can control targeting your queries well based on careful research of who you're sending to.
Can you repeat the book you mentioned? Was it called Query Tips?
Oh, Query Shark. It's a website. I think it's called Query Shark. It's Janet Reed is the agent, and she does a lot of, people will send in their queries and she'll tear them apart. And then she'll show a query that she signed and talk about why it's so great. And a lot of agents will do that. They have a lot of them, I think, on Query Tracker, success stories that have shared the query. And that's a good way to kind of see, oh, okay, yeah, this pitch does sound really great. How can mine be more like that, in the sense of, is mine 3 paragraphs instead of 1? Or is mine completely devoid of interesting detail or drowning in unimportant detail? And again, it's really helpful to find someone to swap with. And Twitter pitch contests sometimes will have prep events before the pitch contest, and that's a great way to connect with critique partners. If you're here, you also already have access to a lot of the Writers League resources. But beyond that, Twitter is a really great place to find writers who will help you just to be helpful, or in exchange for you helping them. And if you don't know them, it's a lot easier for them to say to you, I don't care about this. How can you make this more interesting, and vice versa, as opposed to, you know, your sister who's going to say, this is so great. I'm so proud of you. All the agents are going to want this.
We're going to talk about author credentials very briefly. We had one question. We talked about this, right? What's the best way to note you have publication history? And this is your, you have no publication history, actually. This is the opposite. And this is your first work. So what does the writer say who has nothing to say except, I've got my manuscript and it's available, and I've told you all the other stuff you need to know about it?
That's totally fine. You can say, this is my first manuscript. What I don't like to see is, I finished this last night. Or like, I remember like week 2 of pandemic, people were already sending me their novels they wrote, maybe not week 2, maybe like week 4, their novels they wrote in lockdown. And I was like, this is not ready for anyone. Like, even the most genius person did not write a ready book in 3.5 weeks. But yeah, you can just say, this is my first manuscript, or this would be my debut novel, whatever feels comfortable to you. You don't need to have a long bio just for the sake of having it. It's just what's relevant to either your experiences that you've put in your book, or things that show how you're investing in yourself as a writer. And if you're at the beginning of that process, that's fine. You can state it very simply. This is my first novel, or this will be my debut novel.
I'm so glad you're saying that, because every once in a while someone will say, oh, I read somewhere that agents only want authors who are previously published. And that makes no sense, right? Like, you're looking for new voices just as much. I mean, of course, if someone comes to you and they have a track record and they've been very successfully published, you're not going to say no, but you are looking for those voices that you can discover.
Absolutely. Yeah, everyone wants a splashy, exciting, fresh debut. Then you have no, disappointing past track record to try to put in an appealing context for editors and reviewers. And I mean, I think also a lot of people, are just grabbing at anything to say. So they'll be like, I edited my high school yearbook, like, great, but that's not helpful. I want to see stuff that's relevant to the writing you're doing right now, or the writing enrichment that you're doing right now. And if there's nothing that really makes sense, then it's fine to just leave it very simple.
Perfect. So the work itself, a few questions about the actual work. So for a psychological crime novel set in the year 2000, will an agent suggest that I make it contemporary rather than 20 years ago? I put this one in here because I guess I am just curious how you approach either time periods that are sort of near contemporary, or if these are things that you even consider as when you read a query letter before diving into pages.
Yeah. When and where your book is set needs to feel organic and inextricable for what your book is. So I can imagine taking a client's book and saying, well, this would be better if it was set in 2000 or vice versa. Because ideally, when you've written your book and revised it and refined it and it's ready to pitch, it's set in that time and place for a reason. It's in, Des Moines, Iowa in 2000, because that is a big part of who the characters are and what the challenges they face are. I will just say, because you mentioned psychological crime, a lot of people like to try to set their crime novels before cell phones, because cell phones, and also I guess to some extent romance and other character conflicts, but especially in crime, so many things, cell phones, voicemail, texting, Google on your phone, gets in the way of what you need to happen for your plot, which is not to say that you can't set the book then, but if you're doing it as a way to avoid plot holes, then you should probably be thinking through, is my plot strong enough? Does this make sense? Is this too much of a coincidence? I only mention that because this says psychological crime. But I can't imagine an agent looking at a book set 20 years ago and saying, this is great, but it needs to be contemporary. If they don't like it set in 2000, then it's just not for them.
Yeah, perfect. Do you have a recommendation in terms of how much dialogue in a scene?
I don't think I would say it as a recommendation. I think that this has a lot to do with your voice as a writer. Some writers communicate a lot of story and plot momentum through dialogue. Some writers have much more description and mood setting told through the narration around the dialogue. So it's not that there's a certain amount that works and then it's a good book that agents will want that will make you a lot of money. I think, again, the read it out loud tip that you mentioned earlier is really helpful with this. I will say, if in terms of queries, which is what we're talking about tonight, I don't want the first 3 pages to be all dialogue or no dialogue. So I would suggest making sure they're somewhat balanced in kind of your first chapter, because we want to be seeing the world of the book, getting to know the characters, either seeing them with the third person narrator or inside the head of the first person narrator. But then we also want conversations to start happening and not just someone silently walking around their apartment or whatever. So that's the only place probably that I would look at. Do I have too much of one thing or the other? But for the most part, I think this is going to speak more to your voice than something objective to impose on your book.
Perfect. All right, let's see where we're at now. Second time's the charm. In regards to querying an agent, if you get a full partial request on a book and they give positive feedback, should you mention that when you query another book? If you do a major overhaul, can you re-query? Where do you come down on either of these or both? The, I've done some work, should I go back to that person? And then also the idea of mentioning that first book you sent in when you're ready to query your next book.
Yeah. To the first one, I'd say definitely mention it. Maybe not if you just queried them, but definitely if they requested more material and read it, that means there's something they really liked. They probably will not remember your name, but it is helpful to say, thanks so much for reading 2 years ago. Here's my new manuscript. As to requerying, for this, you definitely want to research the agents or agency's guidelines and see if they address it, or their FAQ page, or see if they've discussed it on Twitter. Beyond, if there's not a clear answer readily available to you about their policy, I would suggest sending a query that just says, since you last saw this project, I've substantially revised it. I'm wondering if you're interested in taking another look. Again, I think that's more if they've requested it and interact with more of it than just a query, but you can also requery. You can requery no matter what, I guess, but what sets you up most for success and and also keep in mind that you're starting a working relationship with this person. You're not trying to pull a fast one and sneak in. You're ultimately going to be sharing the whole breadth of your work with them, and the whole, like I always ask, tell me about your query experience. How long have you been shopping this book, to get a sense of who they are and what their experience has been, and what sort of morale level they're coming in with when I'm offering representation to someone. So then it would be a little bit odd if they're like, well, actually, I queried you 3 years ago and you read these 2 manuscripts. So I would mention it, as we've said with other things, briefly, matter-of-factly, because I would always like to have all the relevant information. It's going to be a little bit of a, oh, okay, I liked something before, I might like this. It's not going to be a, oh God, no, delete, at least for me. But definitely, again, research and see if that specific agent has said what they like to do about this as part of preparing to reach out to them again. But in general, I think both these things are going to be fine.
Great. Let's talk about the agent-author relationship. You still going? You doing okay, Sharon?
Yeah.
Okay. If my agent signs a contract with me for only one work, is it okay to query other agents for my other works? The agent is very busy and unresponsive. I have no idea what's going on with my book. Don't want to cut the ties. Where do you come down on this? I'm assuming probably I know your answer.
Well, you want to make sure you know what your contract says. And even before you sign that contract with that agent, when you're talking to them, when they're offering representation, you can and should ask what their perspective is on, are they going book by book, or are they signing you for your career? For example, at my agency, we sign clients for their careers, which is not to say that you can't leave, but I'm looking to take on people that I like their voice and how they look at the world and how they tell stories, not just, okay, great, this book, I'm going to sell it and hope for the best. So you would ideally have been clear on that going into the agent relationship. But then when it is time, when you're feeling very unsatisfied, as it sounds like this sounds like a really horrible situation. I don't think that you query for your other works. I think you just leave the agent. And again, make sure that you're not violating your contract, but this is not someone who is really your agent. If you don't know what happened to your book and they're not responding to you, whatever they're doing, they're not supporting you as an agent should. You should want to cut ties with them and take all your work to someone who will believe in you and support you. It's said a lot, a bad agent is worse than no agent. I know it's hard to believe that when you're in the no agent side of it, but this is not someone who is making your work stronger or getting you, this thing you've described is not someone who's getting you closer to a great publisher who will make your book a success and get it to readers. So I think it's definitely okay to query other agents for your work period, but not this agent is still your agent on this book, and then you're going to get another one for your next book, to the extent that your contract allows you.
Yeah, and that's scary, right? It's scary.
Yeah, it's really scary
to cut ties and not know if you're going to find someone else. But you're right; it's better to be in a, in no relationship than a bad relationship. I've studied in various genres and have multiple picture book manuscripts, a middle grade novel that's plotted and partially complete, and I enjoy writing screenplays as well. How would I best find an agent who's open to representing multiple genres?
So my advice is start with agents who represent what you want to do next, what you think that your strongest work right now is that you would want to be shopping next. Picture books and middle grade novels, there's a lot more overlap there. A lot of agents do all kids categories or mini kids categories, and it's also not as difficult a leap as, if you were writing sci-fi and picture books or something like that. But keep this in mind in your query process when you're making kind of like, okay, here's the first 10 people I'm going to query, and then the next 10 people after that. You can prioritize for those first 10 people who do primarily middle grade books, but have sold a picture book, or vice versa. And then you discuss that when you have an agent's interest and they've called to discuss your work with you. You can say, I'm also writing these picture book manuscripts, or I know I want to return to this middle grade novel I've been working on. are you open to working in that genre? How does that work for you? But in terms of finding the agent, I think you have to pick a place to start. And I would suggest starting with the thing that you think is the strongest that you know you want to do next.
Perfect. All right. Can you please speak about the role, what they do, what they don't do of an agent in relation to a traditionally published author, a hybrid author, and an indie published author? And, I kind of want to zero in on the hybrid, especially because I think that we talk a lot about what an agent does for you as a traditionally published author in terms of the big houses.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd be curious how you approach that sort of hybrid publication.
Yeah. So I guess I'll address this in terms of what the benefits would be, or what services that agent would be offering you. One of the big things is they're going to make sure that your agent or your contract with the traditional publishing house leaves the space you need it for your hybrid books, and the option clause, the non-compete, all the things that the publisher wants to say about when you can publish your next thing and whether they get to see it or not. They're going to cover out space for your self-publishing activity so you can do both. And then the other major thing that the publisher will do is your subrights. For example, maybe they'll represent foreign rights potential for your self-published books. Even though you self-publish them here, maybe France wants to buy them and translate them. Or maybe they handle film interest for your subrights on your self-published book. And then I think the other thing would be helping you when you are ready, you finished your series that you self-published and you want to think about which thing should I write next. They can help you strategize in terms of your story ideas. What does it make sense to focus on? Is this one likely to sell well to a traditional publisher, or will it be a harder sell? Maybe you can make more money publishing it yourself because your readership will love it and knows how to find it in self-publishing. It's kind of that big picture strategy help. So you're not flailing about by yourself, figuring out when and where to do what.
Perfect. All right. Is there an understood or accepted process for ending a relationship with an agent? And, we just alluded to cutting ties. Are there any tips you can give for that moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's not fun. It's awkward for both parts. But this is someone that you've worked with very closely and you want to show them respect, and ideally they will be showing you respect as well. So you just have a conversation and say, I feel that we don't have the same vision for my work, or I've been frustrated that you don't seem to have time for me, or, whatever the reasons are. You can state them professionally and kindly, but honestly. I think it's very important to end with one agent before you start shopping for a new one, for a variety of reasons that we probably don't need to discuss at length here now. But even though that is scary, and even though it might be tempting to say, well, I'm not going to leave my agent unless I find a new one, the etiquette is kind of not to start shopping to new people before you've told your previous agent, this is not working out, and my next book, I'm going to go elsewhere. And then also just make sure that you understand what the process is in your agreement with that agent, and what will happen with your books that they have sold for you. If those come with you to your new agency, if the rights stay with your old agency, just make sure you're clear on all of that. So you know what you're bringing to your agent search, and you know what you might need from your previous agent once you've parted ways.
And I also think it's rarely a shock to either party if the conversation is initiated by one party, And usually if as an agent, you know when you're not doing as well as you could be doing for a client. And I think the other way around, like clients usually know if maybe they're not operating in a way that makes their agent comfortable or happy. So,
and I think if you feel like, when you're thinking about doing this, if you feel like, oh my gosh, they're going to be so mad, or like, oh, but I don't know what they're then going to say about me to my editor, or like something like that, that you're really worried about how they're going to treat you or treat your books. As stressful as that is, that's a big sign that you should be leaving, because that means that you don't think that they're a professional person, or you don't think that they have your best interests and your book's best interests front of mind. So even if that makes it a messier experience in the moment, if you're feeling that way, that means you definitely are not with someone that is supporting you the way an agent should be.
Yeah. How important is it that my potential agent has a lot of experience?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Young agents, new agents can be really great because they're really hungry and they have a lot of time for you, and they're going to work really hard for you in a different way from an agent who already has 50 clients and you're their one new client this year. So it's not just, does this agent have a track record or not? Oh no, they've only sold 2 books, they're not going to be good at it. You want to, if you're looking at an agent who seems newer like that, you want to look at the agency they're at. Has this agency sold books to a whole bunch of publishers that I would want to work with? How old is this agency? How long has it been around? Does it have clients that I've heard of? And it's also completely fine to ask this to an agent when you're having a conversation with them. You can say, you know, I know you've only been doing this for a couple of years. Can you tell me a little bit about the support your agency offers you, or, you know, however you want to phrase it, to get a sense of, do you think that they have the support and the resources at their agency to help them where their experience isn't there yet? A new young agent at a well-established agency can be a really great kind of best of both worlds for you. If they're a new young agent at a brand new young agency, then you might run into more, I don't want to say problems, but there might be more things that are new or challenging to the whole agency, not just new or challenging to your agent.
Yeah.
In a way that might not support you as well as you should be supported by your agent.
Great. It's interesting because I don't think it's unethical to have multiple agencies representing different books if everyone's aware. But what do you think of the idea of having multiple? Would you want to have one of your clients represented by another agent, is another way that I would phrase
it. Our agency does not do that. We do not share representation. So if you have an agent who only does creative nonfiction, for example, that's all they do, that's all their agency does. There are agents who only do nonfiction, and so they do encourage and allow you to have a fiction agent, but then you would need to have a fiction agent who is open to only representing your fiction. So it's not that it's unethical, it's that you just need to communicate with everyone about that. And I also think I don't think that benefits you starting out of the gate to try to find 2 different agents for 2 different kinds of projects. If you end up there in a situation like I just described, that can work great. But that's also more wrangling of schedules and figuring out, you know, who's making sure this non-compete clause leaves any space for the book that Jessica is doing. So I don't know that I would suggest, I don't think it benefits you to pursue this unless, you know, my dream agent only does nonfiction and I know someday I'm going to want to do fiction. But I don't think it benefits you to do this just for the sake of doing it, I guess.
Was that Jessica Pepin that you were referencing in that?
Oh, maybe. Probably. She does do amazing nonfiction, so that's probably why her name pops to mind.
You know, her client, Kate Dawson-Winkler, is
oh, that's right,
at our conference.
Yeah.
So success story. I love that.
Yeah.
What's the best way to become familiar? I think we kind of touched on this, the idea of doing the Googling, looking at the Twitter, and also obviously the websites and that sort of thing. But in terms of assessing compatibility, I mean, that's also going to come down to having a phone call or having some kind of opportunity to talk to someone before you say that you're going to work with them.
Yeah, you can get a big sense of that in just the initial emails you're exchanging, the phone call. This doesn't necessarily help with compatibility in terms of how well you hit it off, but you can also ask to speak to their agent or to their other clients. If you know it's really important to you to have more phone calls and emails or different things like that in terms of your working style compatibility, talking to their other clients is a great way to get a feel for that.
Great. We sort of talked about this as well, right? Good connections with editors sort of comes from both the agent, but then also the support they get from their agency. But does the acquisitions editor care mostly, I like the way this is phrased, care mostly about the book and the writing itself? Or does the relationship with the actual agent come into play?
Yeah, they definitely care most about the book and the writing itself when it comes time to acquire it, make a pitch for it at their meeting, spend 2 years working on it. However, I think most editors have agents that they know tend to send them stuff that's really aligned with their taste. So there are certain editors that always read my stuff very fast because they always, even if they don't buy it, they always really like it. I think editors tend to know if agents tend to send stuff that's ready versus maybe not as ready. They know the agents that are a good, when they've had a book with someone, they know the agents that are a good fit for their working style or are good at, supporting clients in a way that makes their job easier instead of harder. They know the agencies that are legitimate and are not going to be difficult in the contract process. So I think that maybe sometimes if they're a little on the fence about a book, the agent or agency can tip it into, yeah, I think I want to try to buy this, or maybe I'll let this one go. But all of that is sort of the gravy. It's not, no one's going to buy a book from me that they don't love just because they like me, or not buy one that they do love because they think I'm too much of a pain in the butt when it's time for payments to arrive. I hope. So yeah, it's important for them to have good contacts in general in publishing, but I send books and sell them to editors that I don't know very well all the time, in addition to ones that I do know really well. So it's more that they have good contacts with editors, but also know how to connect with editors that might be just right. And some of that does come down to how long have they been doing this? What is their agency like? In ways that you might not have a full picture into, but you can get a sense of from the questions that you ask when you speak to them and from researching their agency.
Going to talk really briefly. Let's see what these, I don't remember what these questions are. So I have a self-published trilogy, historical fiction. The first two have gotten good reviews. Would it be appropriate to query agents with the trilogy to see if there's interest? So it sounds like I think we answered this earlier. Am I correct?
Something new. Write something new.
Yeah, write something new. And the chance of a self-published author or book getting noticed, we talked about this already too, right? You sort of told us.
Yeah. I don't think that the mergers have very much directly to do with this as much as just there are fewer places now and more people wanting to get into them. And so a self-published book, I guess maybe I should say the thing with a self-published book is either it doesn't have very many sales and they say, okay, great, people don't want this book, or it sold a ton of copies and they think, okay, great, everyone that wants this book already bought it. Yeah. So whichever side of that range you fall into, I would suggest write something new.
Can't really win with that one, huh?
Which again is not to say it never happens, but it usually doesn't. And you hear about it when it does because it is such a anomaly.
So what about agents who work with writers who cross over from genre to genre? Yes, some do. You got to do your research, right?
Do your research and then communicate about it when they've offered and you're deciding if you're going to choose them or say yes or no.
Perfect. What about something outside the box? So Lincoln in the Bardo. I think it's Lincoln in the Bardo actually, but is it at the Bardo? Anyways, something that is written in an untraditional style. What are agents excited for that? Are agents nervous about that? What do you recommend to a writer who's sort of breaking the mold?
Yeah, I think, again, you really do your research. Some agents would be really excited to try something experimental or unusual, but they're also going to need to be able to understand how they can sell it. What are the comps for it? Maybe you want to use something like Lincoln at the Bardo, or A Visit with the Goon Squad, or Where'd You Go, Bernadette, or something that speaks to a comp that speaks to your unusual format, even if the story is nothing similar. It's not that agents love this or don't love it. It's that some do and are successful with it. Some don't, because that's not what they get and are good at. So do your research, see what they're asking for on Twitter, see what they've sold, hope for the best.
Yeah, and don't expect an agent to figure out how to talk about your work in a way that makes it sound compelling. Like, you've got to figure that out and then attract an agent to it who can see even more about, even more ways to talk about it that's going to be compelling.
The other thing I would love writers to keep in mind too, Lincoln at the Bardo was George Saunders' eighth book. Daisy Jones was Taylor Jenkins Reid's sixth or seventh book. A lot of these books that are more experimental and form breaking were not the debut. They kind of built a track record. They built a readership. They got prize credits or whatever that then allowed them the freedom to take a little more risk, which is not to say that you can't debut with that. But when you're looking at something and saying, well, that worked, how come no agents want mine? You kind of also want to look at the whole context of the writer's career and figure out, did they wait to become experimental, or is this just always their voice? Is the way that you're telling your story the best way? Or are you doing it because it's fun and interesting in the moment, but maybe it doesn't have to be quite as unusual as you started out with? Maybe it does, and that's great, but maybe it doesn't, and that was a learning experience. And you can revise it to be a little more, find 20 agents that want it instead of 6.
Perfect. I think we sort of answered this, but it's the question, something a little more experimental. Do I bypass agents altogether and go to smaller publishers? And I guess I wanted to hear your take on this, because I believe that a lot of agents are well versed in the small publishers as well, and could very well, still be of value to you, and may decide that that's where your book belongs. But what do you think of writers bypassing agents and just going directly to publishers that take direct submissions?
Yeah, I think it is important to have a clear view of what you want from your overall publishing experience, and self-examine why you're going right to small publishers. Are you just eager to get the book out there and discouraged from hearing all the no's? Something like this, I would suggest figuring out, do I think my book has a home with a major publisher? Would I be successful hustling alongside the small publisher even more than I would have to do at a major publisher to make sure people hear about my book? And then, depending on the answer of what you really want and what support you need, maybe you need to put this down for a year or two and focus on building up your platform, or placing pieces in literary journals, or whatever credentials you need to amass around your experimental memoir to convince an agent that people are going to listen to you and be excited to hear from you. Maybe you pause and put that time in. Maybe not. Maybe it's more important to you to get this out sooner, and you like the idea of working with a small press and being more hands-on. That's fine too. But instead of just doing it to do it quickly, figure out, why am I doing this, and which part of this will get me to my actual goals overall, not just the book will be printed soon, if that makes sense.
It does. I also think sometimes folks assume that small publishers are going to be easier to get to, or to get on the list of, when in fact there are a lot of really great small publishers out there that are extremely selective in terms of what they're publishing. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's the home run you expect it might be if you're just going to smaller publishers.
Mhm.
All right. I think this one's about the idea of going back to someone that you have a query out with, and for a second book before you've really figured out if they're interested in the first book, which I feel like we've probably, if not directly touched on, sort of touched on. But how do you think?
Yeah, I would say, so I would not suggest querying 2 books at once, either to the same agents or 2 books out to different agents. In terms of whether to mention or remain silently patient, you want to look at that agency's guidelines for what are the response times. Do they say, if you don't hear from us in 8 weeks, it's a no? Do they say we get back to everyone within 4 to 6 months? See what they say about when they want to be followed up with or not, and respect that. I don't think it's going to serve you 6 weeks later to be like, oh, by the way, I have this other book you're going to like too. She's either reading or she's not. It's not that she's waiting to see if you're going to give her more information. She's busy. Her kids are at home. Her dog is sick. Her computer, like any number of things have happened to mean that she hasn't gotten to your book in her reading queue yet. So I don't think that popping in to say, here's another thing I also do that wasn't already in the initial information you gave her is going to spur her on to read any faster. I think you do mostly just have to be patient.
All right. Last question we received was, will we be holding an annual Agents and Editors Conference this summer in person? So I did want to just mention that we will have a conference this year. Our fingers and toes and everything else are crossed that it's going to happen September 17th to 19th, though we moved it to September so that it would be more likely to actually happen. So for sure, save the date for that. If you haven't been to our conference and you want more information, we can certainly give it to you and you can check out our website. But I know that Sharon, you've been to our conference and I think you had a good time.
I had a great time. It's one of the best conferences I've ever been to.
You're so nice.
And you fed me really well.
Did. We take very good care of our beautiful agents and editors who are joining us and giving us their time. So I want to do a really rapid fire because it is so late for you and I just want to get you out of here. Do you look at literary magazines and journals? Do you pay attention to writers and discover them in those places?
I would love to say yes. I don't do it as much as I probably should. That's partly because they tend to skew more literary than the bulk of my list tends to be. But it's also more just because of time. I don't often have the time to, I'm reading for my clients, I'm reading my queries, I'm reading my conference requests. And then when I'm not reading that, I'm watching Schitt's Creek for the 80th time or, rereading Tana French for the 90th time or doing things that allow my brain to turn off a little bit. So as much as I would love to be better about scouting in those places, I am not. That said, those credits can be very important in really getting an agent excited fast in your query. And if you want to do something that's very literary or the experimental memoir someone mentioned earlier or a short story collection, those kinds of things are important. And people who work in very literary categories in a more concentrated way than I do are scouting those places more dedicatedly than I am currently.
How big is your reading list right now? How big would you
I don't want to know. In terms of how much I'm
or how many pending, either things that you asked for that you need to read or things of your clients that you're waiting to read or
I know.
things that are actually in your
Yeah. So my request list right now is actually pretty small. I only have 6 manuscript rating. That is because my query folder is such a disaster. So I haven't requested very much yet since kind of catching up over the holidays. My client reading list, I think I have 3 or 4 full manuscripts and like 3 or 4 partials that have come in over the past couple weeks that I need to get to in the next, few weeks.
24 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, again, not even that bad. Like, I know that doesn't sound terrible. And people are like, why does it take you so long to do that? But yeah,
That's a lot. And that's the start of the year where you probably ended the year trying to feel like, okay, I got everything off my plate. And now it's starting to, I mean, in 3 months, it's gonna,
And I haven't done, I think this is my first conference-esque thing this year. So my kind of priority query folder is basically empty at this point. And that is also something that takes a lot more time, because when someone queries me after an event like this or a conference, I try to give quicker attention to those than just the cold queries and give a little feedback if I can. So it's going to get worse as the year goes on. I shouldn't say worse. It's going to get more demanding as the year goes on.
So we've had more questions, but I'm so aware of your time. The last thing I would say, I imagine there are a lot of folks who are on this webinar right now who are listening to you talk and are thinking, oh my gosh, I want to work with Sharon. How do I, so what would be your recommendation for how folks, if they wanted to reach out to you after tonight, how could they do that?
Yeah. Go to our website, dystel.com, which is DYSTEL. And if you go on I think it's called Meet the Agents, something like that, and look for my face and click on it, then there's my little bio, a little bit about what I'm looking for, and my email address. And then I'm also on Manuscript Wishlist, which I mentioned, that you can find a little more detail about what I'm eager to find, which I probably need to update now that I mentioned that, but that's going to be a pretty good starting point. And then you can also look at my query tracker and see if people think I'm nice or mean. Hopefully nice, but you can see for yourself. And then, feel free to query me. Mention that you're at this webinar. If you do have a burning question that you can't answer readily with your own research, feel free to send it over and mention this webinar, and I'll do my best to answer it in a somewhat timely fashion. Yeah.
You're so kind. I'm going to ask you one more question because I had it come across a couple of times and I hate to ignore it. Sure. How do you feel about pen names?
Fine. I think, I'll want to ask why you're using one. I would say query in your own name. And mention, this is Becca Oliver writing as, Barbara O'Neill or whatever. They can be very helpful if, for example, if you're writing in 2 different genres and want to keep your erotica separate from your middle grade or something like that. I think they tend to be used more effectively if you've had a couple books come out that haven't done well and you need to rebrand. But with the agent, you want to be straightforward about who you actually are and the reasons that you're using a pen name. I wouldn't suggest querying under a pen name to try to hide the fact that your first series tanked, or you already self-published this book or anything like that, because you want to work with an agent with mutual trust and open communication, not try to sneak in and hope that they don't catch the reason that you think they might not be excited to work with you. But yeah, I'm not pro or against pen names. It's just, what is your goal in using one, and does that make sense for what the book is and how I would want to sell it?
Perfect. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for doing this. You are a dream. The fact that you
that's so nice.
out to offer to do this. I mean, you heard me, my plea, my call on Tuesday evening, and responded to it, which was so kind. And I've learned so much just listening to you this evening.
Well, thank you.
Folks are just chiming in over the chat box and saying thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So you're the best. I can see why Amy Gentry will not stop singing your praises.
Amy's the best. Well, thank you for having me. Definitely send me your great stuff attendees. Like I said, I had a great experience at this conference, and anytime someone comes my way via Writers League, I know it's going to be good stuff. So I will look forward to seeing your projects, and everyone have a good weekend.
Awesome.
Thank you, Becca.
Thank you. Have a great night. Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye. All right, everyone. Thanks for being here. You guys are great. And we'll gather some links from tonight and some of the things that Sharon mentioned and send them out to you. We'll follow up with an email to everyone who RSVP'd. But have a great evening. Consider coming to our conference in September. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to happen. And keep an eye out on all the stuff that we have going on, both on our YouTube channel. You can find a lot of videos, and you can also just reach out and come to our website. Take care and have a great night.